I know people are, anyone catching a plane or flights? Okay, maybe that's tomorrow. I know my 3 to 6 class is just not going to happen. All right, so the first outbreak of Ebola in the United States dates back to 1989 in Reston, Virginia, at a monkey laboratory. It's about 1,500 miles from Austin. A debilitating and deadly virus spread through a population of monkeys at this laboratory, and they'd been brought in from the Philippines. In the initial days, scientists at the Center for Disease Control thought that the virus they saw under their scanning electron microscopes was Ebola virus. They thought that they were looking at a case of Ebola Zaire. It turned out that it was a different virus, Ebola Reston. So similar to Ebola, but a slightly different strain. They donned hastily assembled Ebola suits. You can see these containment suits here. They were pretty anxious that you could have a situation where Ebola jumped from one of these infected monkeys from the Philippines into a human host, maybe a laboratory worker at Reston, Virginia, and that this would then spread into the general population in the United States. So they were really pretty freaked out. It turned out that the monkeys had Ebola Reston, and luckily up to today, it is not known to have ever infected people or perhaps even be viable in humans. In today's lecture, I want us to think about the history of what is, in fact, an emerging disease. This is a new disease that was first identified in 1976, so about 40 years ago. There's been a lot of talk in news media about Ebola outbreaks in Africa. I want us to look more closely at some of the initial epidemics that happened in African context to just think about really were these little isolated villages, what was going on, get a better context of those places that were impacted. And as we'll see, the laboratory outbreak at Reston was not the only laboratory case of Ebola. There were infections, transmission of Ebola at laboratories in Europe and Southern Africa. But for many years, Ebola remained a very rare condition, one that was highly exotic and limited to select sites in African countries. And in fact, it was one that is going to captivate the minds of bioweapons manufacturers in the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. As we all know too well, in late 2013, early 2014, Ebola surfaced again, this time in the West African country of Guinea, and it has now created a devastating epidemic that the picture of which is still emerging. So let us go back to 1976, which I know for many of you is a bygone era, one that you see in orange tinted filters in Instagram or perhaps in your pictures from family photo albums, possibly around the time when the color for this room was identified. No, I guess UT is orange, so it's hard to know. But orange was big in the 70s, orange and green. The first recorded case of Ebola was around June of 1976 in the town of Nasra in what is now South Sudan. It's possible that there were earlier cases of Ebola, but we just don't know about them. You know, that they weren't under the radar of physicians. They didn't make it into a laboratory setting. Indeed, when a few people working at a cotton manufacturing facility in Nasra began to feel feverish, have body pains, vomiting, and diarrhea, physicians at the medical clinic associated with the cotton facility assumed it was any variety of diseases with those kinds of symptoms. So we've looked at some of those possibilities. Maybe it was malaria, it could have been yellow fever. Lassa fever is another fever that's common in parts of Central and Western Africa. It might be Marburg virus, which as we'll see was a infection that had been found in laboratory workers in Marburg, Germany, associated with green monkeys. It might even have been influenza. As it turned out, as we're going to see through later examination, this was an early case of Ebola. And it was not contained in the cotton-producing town of Nasra. This town, nestled in the forested area of Sudan, was actually within close distance of several other major towns. From June to November of 1976, cases cropped up in Tambura to the north, Maridi to the east, and a bustling hospital at Juba, and again, what is now South Sudan. Also one further north at Omdurman. You can see here's a map of some of the cases in South Sudan. Now, around the same time, so this is again 1976, late 1976, a group of Belgian nuns, nursing sisters, in the neighboring country of what was then Zaire, is now called Democratic Republic of Congo, treated a cluster of sick people with similar symptoms. The first patient, we believe, was Mabolo Lokela, a 46-year-old school principal. He went on a tour of towns somewhere in the Central African region. It's possible that he may have come in contact with somebody who'd been at this epicenter in Sudan. In fact, you could take buses around this area between the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zaire, and South Sudan, what's today South Sudan. It took about 4 days, so people were making this journey. There was some possibility of traffic, but we don't really know how he might have contracted Ebola. What happened is he visited a mission hospital called Yambuku Hospital, and he thought he had malaria. So he asked the Belgian nuns who worked there, the sisters, nursing sisters, for an injection of chloroquine. And it turned out that his malarial symptoms actually went down. He dies, however, from what we come to understand was Ebola within a couple of weeks. So you can see here Yambuku in northern Zaire, not too far from the Sudanese border, what's today South Sudan. And Maridi, you can see, is one of the epicenters near Nasra, that cotton town. At the time, an international commission studied the disease, and they decided that Lokela, this Zairean school teacher, we don't know how he became infected with Ebola, but he managed to infect people in over 55 towns and villages. Now, how did this happen? And I think it's important to understand, because when I was doing some reading on this, I was struck by the fact that Ebola is not happening in sort of an isolated village at the end of a footpath where nobody ever goes. If it did, we wouldn't know about it, right? You know, these have to be cases that are diagnosed in laboratories that come under the purview of biomedical facilities. And in fact, it was the biomedical facilities that were to blame in this instance. The Yambuku Hospital, and this is a picture of the Yambuku area from around 1976, the Yambuku Mission Hospital dated to 1935 in the colonial period. By the 1970s, about 12,000 people would visit it every single month. And they came often for over very long distances, sometimes by foot, sometimes by truck or taxi, to get care, often for malaria and other conditions. Women in labor, they would travel to the Yambuku Hospital. The Belgian nurses who worked at the Yambuku Hospital did not use clean syringes. And so others who visited the hospital in the weeks after Lokela gets his injection of chloroquine to treat his purported case of malaria are going to get exposed to Ebola. The international report at the time said that 5 syringes and needles were issued to the nursing staff each morning for use at the outpatient department. Okay, so they would get 5 syringes. They would be used at the outpatient department, the prenatal clinic, and the inpatient wards. These syringes and needles were apparently not sterilized between their use on different patients, but were rinsed in a pan of warm water. At the end of the day, they were sometimes boiled. The surgical theater had its own ample supply of instruments, syringes, and needles, which were often kept separately and autoclaved after use. Now, within a month, 11 of the 17 members of the hospital staff die of Ebola, and the hospital is hence closed, okay? During a 2-month span from 1st September to 24th October 1976, there are 318 confirmed cases of Ebola, 280 deaths. So this is something that definitely made its way into the international news. People were aware that something is going on at this hospital in Yambuku. Peter Piot was a young Belgian scientist who volunteered to travel to Zaire, to the hot zone, to study this new and strange disease. He had worked at a lab in Belgium where the initial samples of blood out of Zaire are going to be distributed. And how did this happen? There were some Belgian airline pilots on Sabina Air, and they were handed a thermos. You guys remember thermoses? Inside the thermos was some ice and a couple vials of blood. And actually, when they, according to Pio and his testimonies, and there are lots of them online now because he's a big man to be talking about, you know, the person who discovered Ebola in the 70s. He's still very active in disease eradication and control. He claims that actually one of the vials had shattered. And so inside of this thermos was sort of like a mix of ice and blood and broken glass. There were a number of times when he and the research team in Belgium could have been exposed. They did not actually get Ebola. He goes to Zaire to better understand what's happening. And he recalled that he was sitting one night with a group of international scientists, also Congolese researchers. They were trying to think about what should they name this emerging outbreak. Should they call it Yambuku disease? And they thought that's kind of giving Yambuku a bad name. Someone said, well, let's see, what's the closest river? And he looks up at a map that was posted on the wall and says, it looks like it's the Ebola River. Let's call it Ebola. And so that's the story, you know, of legend of how the name Ebola came about. It's not something that had been known for many, many years. It's a completely fabricated sort of name, and unfortunately the Ebola River is now stigmatized. And it turned out it wasn't actually the closest river. But the name has definitely stuck. They use scanning electron microscopes to look at samples of bloods from infected individuals during this outbreak, and they revealed a long filovirus similar to the green monkey disease, the Marburg virus, which had been identified in Germany, a hemorrhagic fever. In this first outbreak of Ebola Zaire virus, medical teams took very careful records to see how long after exposure people got sick and how many people died. So they thought it was about a week to 14 days after exposure that someone could develop the virus, and a very high number of people were dying, 80–90%. Now the fear at the time was that the virus would reach Kinshasa, the capital city of Zaire, which is about 1,000 kilometers, maybe 630 miles from Yambuku, where this hospital was, where it sort of all started. In fact, one of the Belgian nurses who got infected travels to another nurse, right? Yambuku hospital is not happening. Everybody's dying from Ebola. She goes to another hospital and she manages to infect nurses who are there. One of these newly infected nurses travels to Kinshasa, not knowing that she might have Ebola. And she actually arranged details for a study trip abroad and met with family. Now, when she spiked a fever, health teams requested help from Canada, which sent a portable negative pressure bed isolator, and they quarantined this woman and several other cases in Kinshasa. The last case was recorded on November 5th, and it looked like it wasn't going to become endemic in Kinshasa. In the first week of November, teams of health workers actually went house to house, visiting more than 200,000 people to make sure that there were no further cases and to interview people on their movements. And that seemed to be the end of Ebola. 3 years later, in 1979, it seemed it might all start again when some towns in Sudan that had been impacted in the previous outbreak in 1976 experienced 22 deaths from Ebola. There was one documented case in Congo, but it just really leveled out. It did not take off even the way it had in this 1976 case. And up to today, the 1976 year is seen as the second most virulent year for Ebola against this outbreak now in 2014. So basically from 1980 to 1993, 1994, Ebola disappears. While Ebola in humans seemed to be gone for good, maybe, we didn't know, just this random exotic appearance that had happened once, scientists continued to be fascinated by this mysterious disease. It was the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union stockpiled weapons too terrible to use. You probably know that during this period, there were questions about how many nuclear warheads each country had in its possession, but what about bioweapons? One of the ongoing questions has been whether or not the Soviet Union or Russia, and for that matter the United States or any other country, succeeded in making a weapon out of Ebola virus. Experiments were definitely made to combine genetic material from diseases like plague, possibly smallpox, Ebola, to come up with a way in which maybe Ebola virus could be aerosoled, ways in which it could be injected, ways that it could be used in crowds to infect the enemy. Biopartate in the Soviet Union, perhaps pictured here, the controversies about really where this bioweapons facility in the Soviet Union might have been. This could have been one of the sites where chemical research, biochemical research, disease research was taking place. And the vials of Ebola blood are definitely going to be very much hoarded in this period. There weren't that many cases, right? So you have about 200, 300 cases in 1976. There are some samples of that blood, but that's really going to be the source material for doing research on possible outbreaks. So people are experimenting a lot with Marburg virus, which was found in monkey populations. It really is kind of this secretive movement of Ebola blood. And it looks like there was some transmission, possibly from Belgium to the Soviet Union, of Ebola blood. But again, these are sort of the things of lore. And if you start going down the rabbit hole of Ebola bioweapons online, you can go into some very scary places. We do know that as late as 2004, there was oh, I guess I didn't put a picture here. There was Antonia Presnakova was a Russian scientist who actually dies of Ebola in a lab accident in Russia. And so, you know, Ebola was in that lab in 2004. Now, by 2004, we've had a couple more outbreaks of Ebola, as we'll see. It's not clear at what point files of Ebola blood might have made it to the Soviet Union. Unless you think, you know, this was mere coincidence, this tragedy nicely corresponded with efforts of the United States to implement a bioweapons preparedness program under former President George W. Bush. And there was also a U.S. scientist who was infected at a lab with Ebola in 2004, although they didn't die. So, you know, when people say Ebola was manufactured by the United States to infect Africans, that's not accurate. But there is a history of bioweapons research on Ebola. And this does have implications. Because Ebola was so rare in this period, the only kind of funding to do Ebola vaccine work or therapeutic interventions was coming from like the U.S. military, ostensibly for preparedness in case there was a bioweapons attack. You know, the United States would want to have treatments for anthrax or plague. Ebola was on the list. And so there were small biotech firms that were going to be receiving military funding. So ZMapp, for example, which was one of the early medications tried against Ebola in this recent outbreak, was funded in part by the U.S. military. And so you can see here that right after this woman dies, the U.S. Senate last week unanimously passed Project BioShield, a 10-year, $5.6 billion plan to develop and stockpile vaccines and drugs to protect Americans against biological and nuclear attacks. The House has already approved a similar measure, and President George W. Bush is eagerly awaiting a final version of the bill. It used to be the thing of myth. It's really not the thing of myth anymore. And let's turn to this most recent crisis and kind of the lead up to it in the 1990s. So as I said, from around 1980 until 1993, Ebola disappears in Africa. Now in 1994, Ebola reappears after a 15-year hiatus. And it seems that Ebola cases in humans are somehow foreshadowed by cases of Ebola in animals, especially chimpanzees and other apes. So scientists, hunters, even gold miners going to look for gold in remote areas who came into close contact with infected chimps and gorillas are thought to have caused a number of cases of Ebola in 1994 and 1995 in Gabon, which is pretty close to where we had some of the earlier cases, as well as Cote d'Ivoire. There was a small outbreak in Cote d'Ivoire. By 1995, however, the Democratic Republic of Congo, what was formerly called Zaire, where we had that first outbreak in 1976, in 1995, there was a very large outbreak of Ebola. 250 people die in the city of Kikwit. And about 20% of these individuals were doctors, nurses, and other medical staff. Again, we don't know how Ebola got to Kikwit. It's about 1,000 miles from Yambuku, so again, that area, fairly forested area in northern Zaire. It's possible, again, that this had something to do with hunting patterns. Somebody might have touched a dead animal. We don't know for sure. There were a few other small outbreaks in Democratic Republic of Congo. In 2007, about 187 people die. And in this case, it's thought to have started when a hunter interacted with a chief, and the hunter may have somehow come in close contact with infected animals. So you can see on your handout, I have a list of the 25 outbreaks of Ebola in African countries. I gave you the link here on the CDC website in case you're interested. This is a color-coded map on the left, so it's difficult to see the color coding when it's in black and white. But you can see somewhat of the numbers of people who are impacted, and they're fairly low compared to the thousands of cases that we're looking at right now in Western African countries. So you can see the first outbreaks in 1976 were fairly large, 318, 284, the largest number of cases after this year. And then after that, they're really low level. We have a couple cases here in 1994, 95, the Kikwit outbreak that I just mentioned, 315. The next major outbreak was in Uganda, East Africa. And again, this was quite worrisome because East Africa, we'd had some in Sudan, but it hadn't gone as far over as Uganda. So here you see where Uganda is. So up until 2000, we'd really only had Ebola in DRC, South Sudan, Uganda, Congo, which is, the Republic of Congo and Democratic Republic of Congo have very similar names, but they're actually two separate countries, formerly under French and Belgian control. But those two areas, that's kind of where Ebola had been localized. There had been one random case in Cote d'Ivoire, but it seemed to be sort of something from a monkey. It wasn't, like people dying in large numbers in town. So it really had been centralized in that area, and that's something that you're going to hear in the news media, is that Ebola had never been seen, as we'll see, in Guinea, Sierra Leone, or Liberia. This map is a little confusing because it looks like Ebola is happening all the time all over Africa, but that's why I put it side by side with these numbers, and you can see that we have kind of like three major outbreaks, 1976, again 1995, and then this one in Uganda in 2000. I have here a little bit of a video clip I want to show from PBS, and they were one of the only film crews that's going to make it into Congo, DRC, during an outbreak at Kikwit in 1995. So I'll just show a little bit of this. Again, a lot of, we were talking earlier with Randall and others, that a lot of the teaching materials on Ebola are really dated. So this handout I gave you, which is from the textbook, dates to 2007. And I wonder, they're actually making a new edition of this textbook, which is available on Kindle. I haven't taken a look at it, but I wouldn't be surprised if after this current outbreak of Ebola, it might go into another edition, because this is really looking at it in a speculative way. I mean, it's included in this book on epidemics, which is great, but what we know about Ebola has changed since 2007. I want you to take a look at this because it gives you a sense of some of the hospital settings. The first part is a little bit depressing, but I'll leave it on.
Remains of a disease so virulent, so fearsome. Funeral rites are abandoned and bodies are left for crude mass burial. Kikwit, Zaire, April 1995. One outbreak in one community in one country. But could it become the next plague?
We have no protection for these diseases. We cannot be isolationists in our community. The world is a small community of nations. When one coughs, nobody sleeps.
In Zaire, there survival rate here is 0.
Blood and tissue samples taken from the victims are rushed to scientists at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. Within hours, their worst fears are realized. The killer is Ebola, one of the deadliest viruses on Earth. It can cause a human host to bleed to death in a matter of days.
I think there's a very real possibility that Ebola could come out of Africa to the West, so we've got to get to the bottom of what controls the circulation of this virus and what controls its ability to hop over into humans and what controls its possibilities for spread.
Ebola is a scientific enigma. Since little is known about how it's transmitted, once an outbreak begins, no place on Earth is safe. The CDC sounds the alarm, and a medical SWAT team from all over the world converges on Kikwit, ground zero of the outbreak. Ebola is a formidable enemy. These scientists are risking their lives on the front line of the battle. Their mission is to stop the virus and find out where it came from. They greet each other with the Kikwit handshake, elbow to minimize contact. As the scientists make their way from the airport, they find themselves in a city gripped by terror. The fear of Ebola is spreading. Thousands are trying to flee, but a military quarantine has been imposed. The international team sets up a command post. They join forces with a group of Zairean doctors who have flown in from the capital.
Nous étions très contents de trouver des gens très courageux et c'est
We're very glad to meet so many courageous people from abroad. It's what inspires us and encourages us to fight this to the end. Our families were in tears when we left the capital, Kinshasa, to come here because they knew we were traveling towards death.
My wife believes in reincarnation, so the first thing she said was, if you die over there, I'll kill you, which wasn't very, didn't carry a lot of weight. And then she says, if you die over there, I will hunt you down through the ages and your future lives and will kill you. So I'm being very careful.
The first priority is clear. Find every case and isolate it. The only way the epidemic can be stopped.
We need to talk about it in terms of forms.
An epidemiologist with the CDC, Dr. Ali Khan, establishes procedures for documenting every victim. Missing even a single one could spell disaster.
From here, because I don't have any form, but you say you know about that.
Yes, yes.
Well, but they're missing from here because there's no form on that.
The team fans out across the city to look for new cases. Along the way, they hope to gather information that will help them understand this mysterious virus.
This is an incredible opportunity. There's not an Ebola outbreak very often, and I just have to keep remembering due to surveillance as it contributes to disease control. So you're very tempted to go off in 20 different directions and start 20 different studies at the same time.
This is not the first time that Ebola has struck Zaire. Almost 20 years before, in 1976, an outbreak erupted in a hospital in the town of Yambuku, 1,000 kilometers to the north. The disease spread rapidly, killing 9 out of 10 of its victims, leaving nearly 400 dead. An international team arrived late and had little opportunity to investigate the outbreak. The epidemic was stopped when village elders ordered the temporary abandonment of traditional burial ceremonies, which involved touching the corpse. Instead, they quarantined villages and burned down the huts of the dead. The 1995 epidemic also began at a hospital.
When we got there, the hospital was essentially deserted, the major hospital in Kikwit. There was a scattered patient here or there, many of whom had not been fed for days on time. And we walked through that hospital the first night, and it's sort of memories that you retain for a lifetime.
The local situation was so bad on the medical point of view that we, at least two of us, were involved in the cleaning of the ward. But there were still dead people in the building, and the condition of work was very bad. The safety protection for the worker were absent, not available for them.
I wanted you to see the images of the hospital.
The outbreak was traced back to a surgical procedure performed on a young lab worker named Kim Fumu. 3 nurses who had assisted in the operation soon fell ill. Taking no special precautions, fellow hospital workers attended to their needs, washing them and coming into contact with their bodily fluids. Within weeks, 36 hospital workers, doctors, nurses, and attendants had died, and most of the survivors had fled.
So that was 1995, and I think it's helpful to see that what we're viewing in 2014, it's not the first outbreak of Ebola. But I want to think about what is different about what's going on right now, and why has it gotten so out of control. Now, the past outbreaks were relatively small. We're looking at a maximum of about 300 people who would die of Ebola in DRC or Uganda or Sudan. And in fact, the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, former Zaire, now has a lot of experience dealing with Ebola outbreaks. This is something that they've had to contend with on numerous occasions. And in fact, you may not be aware of this, there's an Ebola outbreak there right now. I think upwards of maybe 100 people now have died of Ebola. But it so far has not spread. Now, why is that? There are a lot of different theories. One is that the past outbreaks of Ebola Zaire in the DRC seem to have been slightly more virulent. So we're getting as high as 90% fatality rates. With the current outbreak, it's a little bit lower, so 70% fatality rates, and with better medical care, even lower. So unfortunately, the longer people live, the more likely they are going to be able to infect somebody else. It seems clear that Ebola outbreaks have been increasing in frequency, and this may have something to do with the destabilization of habitats of animals. In one case, there was a transfer of Ebola from a population of migrating fruit bats, and right now that's the most cogent theory for why we've seen Ebola in West Africa. No one was prepared for what's happened in West African countries of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. This is something that was completely unknown. So it was unfamiliar to people in Monrovia, the capital city of Liberia, as it was for people at Presbyterian Hospital in Dallas. This is something that they had no experience with. There wasn't even a rumor or a legend about 1976, some nurse who might have remembered something. Zero. It just came out of nowhere. So here you can see on this map the number of cases in the last year is more than what we've had in all of the outbreaks so far. In the month of September, we had more cases than had ever happened in any other Ebola outbreak. So it's a completely unprecedented level of exposure that's going on right now. Let's a little bit at the historical context of the three countries most affected. Here you see people praying in Liberia, careful not to touch each other one day in early summer 2014. The three most affected countries are some of the least stable countries in Africa. In particular, the health systems in these countries were already in disarray. Guinea has had corrupt governments that kept mining contracts, resources for themselves, and did not plow money back into the infrastructure. Sierra Leone and Liberia in recent years have been very unstable countries, hit with a series of civil wars and unrest. So there is a strong distrust of government as a result, and people did not even immediately believe that Ebola was real or that it was a virus. For example, in this picture, a neighborhood in West Point in Liberia, which is a very impoverished part of the capital city, young men actually raided an Ebola clinic to get mattresses and blankets and took them back to their homes in the West Point neighborhood. Now, this is a really bad way to contain the spread of Ebola. And so they brought infected bedding, mattresses back into this very congested neighborhood in West Point, and the government actually decided to put in place a militarized quarantine on the entire area of West Point, which is going to exacerbate the problem because these are populations that don't have a good trust of government, that are coming out of a civil war, they're seeing guns and boots in the street. But this was believed in Liberia as like the best hope to try and keep Ebola from getting out of the West Point area. And it really just got epidemic in this part. It really started to grow exponentially. In both Liberia and Sierra Leone, there have been long-standing tensions between First Peoples groups and colonizers or settlers. And in these cases, the settlers were actually those of African descent. So I have on your handout a little bit of just, basic information because you guys are interested enough days before Thanksgiving. You're here, you're actually coming to this lecture. It might mean that you have some terrible passion for history of medicine that I may have helped impart to you. You might even want to try and explain some of this stuff to your family because these are the kind of topical things that do happen when you come. Well, what are you learning in school? We're talking about Ebola, so what can you tell us? So Sierra Leone, which you can see on your map, right? The country of Sierra Leone is right there on the coast, and it started around 1787 as a place for British to repatriate freed enslaved individuals on intercepted slaving ships. So the UK was at the forefront of trying to abolish slavery. Abolitionists would actually release captives and take them back to where they thought would be a familiar setting. The Freetown city on the coast of Sierra Leone was set up. Now, similarly, in the United States, there was an effort to establish a city called Monrovia, named after James Monroe, in 1822. And this started out as a place for people who were living in the United States, who were perhaps living in slavery or had recently been able to become manumitted. They were going to go back to Africa and live as free individuals. Okay, so these things were started with the best of hopes. But what happens is that these colonies are essentially abandoned by the United States and by the UK, and they become places where there's a kind of a replication of the hierarchy that, say, people living in the American South might have found before they went to Liberia. So they set up plantations, they see themselves as Christianized, as civilized vis-a-vis the local population, and you start to entrench tensions that have lasted up to today. So in very recent years, I guess I should also add that someplace like Liberia, their major export is rubber. It's basically controlled by Firestone, which has been exporting rubber to make tires. So this is something that we're all somehow kind of implicated in. I think I mentioned to some of you, like, your diamond rings from South Africa might have led to AIDS. Well, conflict diamonds coming out of Sierra Leone and Liberia, this is all this region where there are a vast number of resources, but the everyday people are not seeing the money. In Liberia, the most recent conflict harkens back to around 1979-1980, and this is a point when a military major named Samuel Doe executed then-President Tolbert. By 1989, the population had become disenchanted with Samuel Doe's leadership, and a new leader rises up named Charles Taylor. He leads a revolt against Doe, and Doe dies shortly after. It may have been under Taylor's orders. Under Charles Taylor, Liberia then goes on to experience a protracted civil war with a lot of violence and upheaval until 2004. So this is like not a happy place, okay? A lot of the Liberians living in Charles Taylor's Liberia are going to flee. This is a place of child soldiers. Some of you may have seen some of the films that have emanated out of this period, like Blood Diamonds. This is not a place where you're going to have a stable educational system. There are lost generations of people who didn't really get much schooling. You're not going to be training doctors, setting up hospitals. These are societies that are really already coming out of collapse. In neighboring Sierra Leone, the situation was not much better, with the civil war underway from 1991 to 2002. So from 1991 to 2002, the situation in Liberia was really about 1989 to 2004. In fact, Taylor in Liberia is accused of helping to fund forces in Sierra Leone. So the wars in Sierra Leone and Liberia are going to intertwine with competing rival factions. The whole area was a complete mess. So you know, if you have any family or friends, people who might be from Sierra Leone or Liberia, you can ask them. They're going to probably start crying and talking about really terrible things that have happened to their families, ways people have had to try and survive and escape. And we really thought that these countries were coming out of the worst period. You know, the UN, British, Nigerian, other African countries all get involved in an effort to stop the violence. They were having peace and reconciliation commissions, really trying to give young people hope. In Liberia, we had the first female president with Sirleaf Johnson. There was a sense that these countries were on the brink of a renaissance. In this situation, we get Ebola. Sometime in late 2013, we believe in Guinea, an index case, the first case, was most likely a child around the age of 2. We don't know how the child got Ebola. So some people are saying maybe a fruit bat had been eating fruit and maybe the child somehow ate the fruit and got Ebola. So, I mean, it's just so scary. It's not like you can do an educational campaign necessarily to stop people from getting Ebola. We don't even know how it's in the system. Some have said perhaps it was the eating of bushmeat. The transmission from bushmeat is actually fairly unlikely. I mean, people cook their meat. They don't eat it raw. It's possible a hunter could handle some meat. We know that's happened possibly once in the DRC. But even that is really, you know, they're actually toning down in public health campaigns to say don't eat bushmeat because, you know, it's become really ethnicized. It tends to be non-Muslims who eat bushmeat, you know, so then are you saying Christians and animists are more likely to have Ebola? Is it a religious war? So we just don't know how this got in the system. And that's scary because it started November of last year. Is it going to start up again in a new part of Africa? Is this something that is going to be a problem that we have to deal with at an ongoing level? This young child who got Ebola in Guinea gave the disease to his mother and then his relatives. And unfortunately, the situation was not quickly contained, as we saw in this example from Kikwit, where the PBS team had gone to document what happened in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1995. We didn't see a groundswell of support for Guinea to contain this at the very onset. There's actually some research looking at big data. Right now, there's interest in using big data, so Twitter feeds, online chit-chat to figure out where there might be an emergent disease happening. And a lot of the algorithms and the programs to do that are written in English. And these are Guinean areas where people are speaking French. So it's possible that big data didn't help us because people were screening all of this chatter and they were missing some of the early articles that did appear online were actually in French and not in English. And not that we should rely on algorithms to find diseases, but it really did remain at a low level. The important thing to remember about Ebola, I've said this numerous times in this class, is that one patient on average infects 2 more people. Okay, so when an outbreak is not contained, you have this natural rate of increase where one person gets Ebola, they tend to give it to 2 people. Within a week or so, those 2 people have given it each to 2 more. You've got 4 cases. A few weeks later, you have 8, then 16, 32, right? You guys do the math. So all of these outbreaks, Guinea then spreads to neighboring Sierra Leone. There are people from Guinea who live in Sierra Leone and back and forth. People attended funerals. In a lot of these parts, the funeral rites are such that The burial is very important, and people say goodbye to their loved ones. They help to bathe them and clothe them in their best and put them into a casket. People draw around the casket, they pray over the body, and they touch and kiss the body. And so this was a way where large numbers of people might assemble for a funeral. They would all get Ebola, and then they would go back to their hometowns and infect their families. So all of these outbreaks started at really low levels. So early 2014 in the spring, you were seeing numbers under 100, and there was a sense that this is something that could be contained as had been done in the past. What was different here is the level of mobility between Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia is extremely high. So for example, I was learning this past weekend, a lot of the fruit sellers in Senegal are actually from Guinea. And in fact, the cost of fruit in Senegal, which is a French country a little bit to the north, has not gone down. So fruit is moving across the border freely. The Guinean traders are in Senegal selling their fruit. People move across these borders. I heard another story where they asked somebody, where's Liberia on the border with Liberia? And they said, oh, Liberia is that tree. And what they've done at some of these borders with Ivory Coast, Liberia, they've literally said, they've set up weaponized kind of barriers where you can't go see your sister who lives right over there. You can't pass this street. You can't go into this country. If you do, we're going to kill you. And so the fear that you saw in the United States, this is happening in African countries. It's really curtailing mobility, and it scares public health workers because it's better in some ways to have kind of freedom of movement, have people set up with checkpoints, and the ability to, if you do think you're sick, go to a hospital or clinic without fear of retribution or arrest. But unfortunately, we're probably going to see more cases cropping up on these border zones because it's so difficult to move and people are becoming clandestine. By July, the situation was getting critical in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. Worldwide attention really focused on Ebola, however, when a man named Patrick Sawyer traveled to Nigeria for an ECOWAS conference. He was an official in the government in Liberia. He was actually a U.S. citizen. He had assisted his pregnant sister shortly before getting on a flight to go to Lagos. On CTV, closed caption TV, right, security TV cameras that people have reviewed in airports that he passed through, including the airport in Accra, Ghana, it seems that he may have known he was sick. So he looks unwell, he lies down at times. When he interacts with customs officials, he doesn't shake their hands, he kind of is holding himself back. He collapses at the airport in Lagos. Fortunately, he's taken right away to a clinic and hospital, and the presiding nurses and doctors think to get an Ebola test, even though he denies ever having been in contact with someone who had Ebola. His sister dies of Ebola. This case leads to a number of other sick individuals in Liberia, and then it spreads to Nigeria. So one of the early Spanish priests who gets Ebola gets it off Patrick Sawyer's sister. He unfortunately dies. About 20 other people in Nigeria die before they manage to contain it and to stop it from spreading around a very highly populated country like Nigeria. Within several weeks, airports in West Africa implemented digital fever checks. Someone who had been infected with Ebola will have a very low-grade fever, and at that point their viremia is low, and they're actually not even going to show up positive for a Ebola test. They're not even going to be contagious, but it's a sign that they may have been exposed. There are now forms that people have to fill in. This is one from the Ghana Health Services at the point of entry and exit in the capital city, Accra, and you have to indicate if you've had any close contact with patients or suspects suffering from Ebola viral hemorrhagic fever in the past 21 days, because that's the incubation period. Now, the possibility of air travel with Patrick Sawyer really opened up a specter of possible transmission of Ebola to the United States. And so none of you guys knew me in July, fortunately, or August, when I kind of went crazy and I had to actually, my family thought I was going nuts. And I kept saying, Ebola's going to come to the U.S. It's really going to come to the U.S. You guys have no idea. I moved to Texas. I went to see a new doctor in Austin. I said, are you Ebola ready? And he was like shaking my hand. I don't know what you're talking about, lady. You're really crazy. I know you're passionate about your subject. You teach history of medicine at Austin. Great. Now I go back there. I was actually visiting them today to do some stuff for my kids going to visit family in West Africa, and they were all ready. You know, they were asking us. They've got their gloves ready. They're totally ready for Ebola. Now, what happened? You guys all know what happened, right? So with Patrick Sawyer, we could have had an earlier case in August come to the United States. He actually had family in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. He was a dual citizen, Liberia and U.S., and he had plans to attend his daughter's birthday party later in September, which unfortunately he doesn't get to make. What if someone did have exposure to Ebola, but they did not have a fever, and they managed to get on a plane? Well, that's what happened with Eric Duncan. He was another Liberian national. He had a sister living in the United States, and sometime in this past summer, she actually travels to Monrovia to help arrange paperwork and a ticket for him to finally come visit her in the United States, in Dallas. In Dallas, Thomas Eric Duncan, had a girlfriend with whom he'd had a child when they were back in a refugee camp during the Liberian Civil War. He had family and friends in Dallas, and he wanted nothing more than to see his son graduate high school. So in September, right before he leaves, he actually assists a young pregnant woman in his building, who we later find out dies of Ebola. And what we know now is that pregnant women are at really high risk of getting Ebola. And when they get it right now, because we only know of the cases in African context where women have been pregnant, basically 96% of women who are pregnant with Ebola are dying. Their fetuses abort early, or the baby dies soon after delivery. So it's really, really harrowing right now for pregnant women. Again, Patrick Sawyer's sister was pregnant, right? And it's just so hard to help yourself. You know, someone's pregnant, they're bleeding, they might be in labor. It's really hard to say, I'm not going to touch you, you might have Ebola. But that's what's happening now in some of these countries. So the situation for pregnant women is very, very dire in this Ebola epidemic. What happened with Eric Duncan is that he was exposed to Ebola. Whether he knew that or he didn't know that is an open question. He gets to Dallas, and his first visit to a hospital, they triage him. He actually, in the reports, he discusses with the nurse that he'd been on a flight from Africa, and she says, oh, I've been on long plane flights before, but they don't talk about Liberia, they don't talk about Ebola, and his early chance of perhaps getting care doesn't go through. Several days later, it's on a Sunday, his girlfriend was at work, she was a nursing assistant, and her daughter comes to check up on Duncan. Her daughter was also a nursing assistant and was in the medical field, and she decides to call 911. When the first responders come, she tells them, hey, this guy might have been exposed to Ebola, you better put some gloves on. And she actually probably saved her family. She bleaches the entire house. She tells everyone not to use his blankets, not to go in his room, because they are confined under armed guard in those first few days before they're moved into another location. And it was very plausible that that entire family was going to die of Ebola. He was highly, highly contagious by that point, vomiting. He even vomited outside of the building when he went to the hospital. At this point, the United States entered a period of extreme paranoia around the issue of Ebola, Ebola in Dallas, Ebola in Texas. Some of you sitting in this room participated in some of that paranoia. My own mother participated in that paranoia. If I put this online, maybe I'll edit this part out. Called me saying that my cousin had gotten a cheap ticket to Dallas to see a friend, and I think it was a good idea. And I said, yeah, my students in class are buying tickets to Dallas. They're like fire sale prices. Nobody wants to go to Dallas. He's going to be fine. And actually that week the nurses did get Ebola, so you wonder maybe your mothers know what they're talking about. You guys laugh now, but those weeks were heady days, weren't they? And so there were a lot of questions. Why did the nurses who got Ebola from Eric Duncan, there were two, why did they survive and Eric Duncan die? We do know that Eric Duncan did not get immediate care. He was a bit older. It's possible that his infection could have been more virulent than the hospital transmission that came to the younger nurses. Nurse Pham, the Vietnamese-American nurse who got Ebola, she was under isolation within 90 minutes of a low-grade fever. So very soon after, as her organs start to fail, she's getting as much medical attention as possible. In these cases where people are in isolation units in the United States, the cases where people have survived, there have been some instances where they've had survivor blood. So the Samaritan Purse missionary nurse or missionary doctor who initially had Ebola and survived in the U.S., he's been a blood match for a number of these cases, and he's donated his blood. He also had received survivor blood when he had Ebola. So that's a possibility. They've done some experimental drugs, but there have been questions. You know, there was a Sierra Leonean surgeon who came to the U.S. last week. He died of Ebola. These are 2 cases of African men dying of Ebola in the United States, whereas we've had cases of health workers treated who have survived. But it would seem that early care is essential. Some of those individuals were high-tech medevaced with like several, dozen doctors at their beck and call. In many of these cases, you've had up to 22, and Eric Duncan, I believe 77 medical staff workers at different points were caring for him. And so even though, there wasn't a treatment, they were doing everything they could to sort of save his kidneys, put him in a coma, hope that they could get him to somehow abate the vironemia and be able to sort of resuscitate him, but it just did not work. And meanwhile, the situation is still unfolding in West Africa. In October, University of Texas Austin students began a drive to raise funds for the Red Cross, one of the organizations in the affected zone. Some of you may have given money to these individuals. This was Ebola week, October 9th to 14th. I would never have imagined that I was going to walk across campus and see signs for Ebola week, but this just shows what can happen in the history of an emerging disease. The situation in Guinea appears to be stabilizing as of this week with fewer new cases. Liberia and Sierra Leone are still experiencing growth, perhaps at an exponential level. And even in Guinea, it's more the capital city, Conakry, where it seems to be under control. In some of the forested border areas where there's less kind of support of state intervention and surveillance, we don't really know what the situation is. So I wouldn't say that it's over for sure. I'll see if I can go online and show you a link from the New York Times, or I'll give it to you guys. But there are worst case scenarios, best case scenarios. Worst case scenarios are that by early January, in just Liberia alone, we're going to have 1.5 million Ebola cases. World Health Organization was asking for about 19,000 doctors or nurses to go to Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea by the first week of December, which would be next week. I did the math. That's 1 in 50 U.S. doctors. So, I mean, that's the level of care that they want to have in place. Ironically, in Guinea, they think the numbers are going basically just based on the same things that have worked in the DRC in the past. People changing their practices, not touching dead bodies, and isolating the sick, and that this is slowing the rate of transmission. In the absence of a vaccine, that's really all that we have. If you had a vaccine, then people who might be exposed to the virus would be less likely to get it, right? But it is still extremely scary times for the Ebola outbreak. And, it's hard to know where this is going to go. We pray and hope that it's going to abate. Like the previous outbreaks seem to sort of die out. But there's really no evidence that that's what's going to happen. This is a sign here of Ebola in the U.S. After Eric Duncan had died. And this kind of gives you a sense of how people are thinking about Ebola in different parts of the world. These are people who can't afford necessarily a smartphone or newspaper, and there's kind of a board where they're getting different levels of truthful information. Yeah, well, like I said, there's a sense here that people think that despite accusation of the U.S. government's creation of the deadly Ebola virus to fight China out of Africa for Africa's resources, the disease has attacked the U.S. from Liberia, killing 1 person and 1 in Spain, and leaving fear. Story continues. So these are the kinds of rumors that are in place. And as I said, there are some truth elements to this. The United States has been involved at a military level in research in Ebola. I mean, this particular strain of Ebola, it doesn't seem that there was any military intervention. There have been outbreaks of Marburg virus and Ebola in the DRC that are very hard to explain, and there have been close to laboratories where there has been research going on. So there's always that possibility if you're a conspiracy theorist. I mean, stranger things have happened, and we can't necessarily discount everything, but it would seem to most minds that this is a naturally occurring phenomenon. A couple more teaser photos. Ebola scare in the city, that ubiquitous Mickey Mouse viral image for Ebola. New York doc has Ebola. Ebola is here. The story continues. So here today, thinking about geographies of Ebola, Biochemists identified a new filovirus named Ebola in 1976, and this was during simultaneous epidemics in Sudan and Zaire. There were small outbreaks in 1979, but then it really went under the radar until 94, 95. Uganda had a first outbreak in 2000, and that was kind of a wake-up call that this could be moving. It wasn't just going to be in the same region in DRC and Sudan, but this particular outbreak, which is about the 25th known occurrence of Ebola in African countries, is really unprecedented. What we're seeing in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone is unbelievable, and really it's a disease that has no cure. There's a question about, is it access to care? Some of these situations, as I mentioned, in the United States, for example, if you have 22 healthcare workers helping you with monitors and every possible intervention as your organs start to fail, you might have a better chance of surviving than if all you have is oral rehydration. Maybe you can't swallow anymore. Maybe there's not enough IVs. The conditions in some of the hospitals and clinics, when people can even get to them, are dire, and people are afraid to go. And the earliest stats we had for the outbreak in West Africa in August, September, were suggesting that 70% of people who went to hospitals, 70% of people who had Ebola and stayed home died. 67% of those who went to hospital survived. So you really only had 3% more chance of survival if you went to a hospital. So people were like, let me stay at home. Let me die with my family and give it to them. Any questions, guys? As I said, this is the first foray into an Ebola lecture, and I think there are a lot of questions I still have, and we'll probably continue to research and look into,
Any speculation why pregnant women would be more likely to?
Women are more likely to contract Ebola. Some people have said it should be called a caregiver's disease because it's those who care for the sick who are getting it, whether they're health workers or people in an intimate family setting. So a young woman who's asked to wash the sheets of somebody who's been sick, somebody who's asked to serve food to somebody who's sick, or just even comfort somebody who's sick. And it tends to be women who are more susceptible. If you're pregnant, you tend to be more likely to get a number of tropical diseases. So like malaria, you're more likely to get malaria if you're pregnant. It's possible that you're compromised. I don't know for sure. But the mortality rate is really high. And when somebody is pregnant and has Ebola, the baby's trying to get out. And it's at that point that hospital workers are really at risk. The amniotic fluids and all the blood, it's just a really dangerous situation. There was a good NPR story about this recently. It was just, honestly, I thought I couldn't be any more upset about the Ebola outbreak. It was just, I sat there in my car completely overwhelmed because there were these doctors and nurses, midwives who were really trying to care for people. Because if everyone's afraid to deliver a baby, it's like people who are perfectly healthy are not getting the care they need.
I'm going to bring you down further, but
that's okay.
Announcement that as I was driving in that the burial teams went on strike.
Yeah, I saw that in Sierra Leone. They dropped the
bodies
bodies in front of the hospital because they're not getting paid. I mean, it's pretty amazing that people are desperate enough. Really, I don't even think it's anything besides just needing the money to do this very dangerous work of burying the bodies. But again, if people are not, and if the money that the nurses and doctors are getting is just paltry. I mean, the interviews with people who are caring for this, it's kind of out of the goodness of their heart. I mean, some of them need to survive, but it's like, I don't know, go eat roots from the forest. Like people are doing this because they just have a heart for the situation. And burial teams are not necessarily so inclined. They're really young guys who are doing it for the money and the cash. There's a possibility that this could get really, 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 really terrible. I mean, it's exponential growth. So unless we stop that chain of transmission and each case is no longer giving 2 more cases, so maybe even 1 case or 1.5 cases, it's just going to keep going.
There's a breakdown of civil order.
Yeah. I mean, there's some rumors right now that President of Liberia, Sirleaf Johnson, she hadn't been seen in public a bit and was wondering, it looked like she may have been in a self-imposed quarantine. Some members of her staff probably had Ebola. It's in the air, so. But it is relatively contained. I mean, not all of Africa is off limits. Right now, it is relatively contained in those countries. And there's a lot of effort to keep people at the borders. They are patrolling them. They are taking temperature checks where they can. The people are trying to do what they can. It's not complete chaos. And I definitely was saying that I went to a video conference call this weekend at a conference with experts in Senegal, doctors and anthropologists and journalists who were actually going into Liberia and Sierra Leone, and they're trying. It's not just kind of like people waiting for foreign aid. There are families and folks who are doing the best that they can. Happy Thanksgiving. Heidi. Well, I think what's interesting about that question is that since we don't know how it got into Guinea, there's really no way of knowing where and when it might crop up somewhere else. Right now, we know that the transmission person-to-person is what we have to worry about, and there's always that worry of somebody you don't know who might travel across the border or whatever, like what happened in Dallas. There is that possibility of fruit bats. It seems to be the best kind of idea, maybe migrating fruit bats. That it's somehow cropped up in the animal population, and there's no way really of knowing. Like there's a lot of work right now to make sure that people don't handle bats and don't interact with them, and people who sell wild game are completely out of business because nobody wants to buy it. So I think that work is being done, but it's just so random. I mean, it's like a kid playing with like a dead mouse. It's hard to know. Something random could just happen. So yeah, it is pretty scary, but at the same time, it's not, because in the past it has really gone underground for like 15, 20 years. It's not something and the numbers are still relatively low compared to, say, kids who are dying from malaria or people dying of HIV, or it's kind of sensational because there's no cure and it's dramatic, but it's not necessarily like the biggest concern of the entire world right now. Like get a flu shot, for example. Yeah. There's that possibility that it will just be endemic. Like they'll never really get to the bottom of it, and it'll just sort of like, hopefully a vaccine will work. Hopefully a treatment will come out in the next year, and then you'll get your Ebola vaccine before you go to these countries. Like you get your yellow fever vaccine or something else. Today is not a good day for happy news. I was telling my friends, I was like, yeah, well, there's the Ferguson indictment, and then I'm going to talk about Ebola, and we're all going to go off looking really happy about the predicament of health insecurity in the African diaspora. It's just, I don't know, man, unlucky. But Liberia and Sierra Leone, Guinea, it's just so unlucky. It's just really, really unlucky. I mean, Nigeria, Senegal, they've contained Ebola. These are not countries that are completely, like, kind of collapsing. And people are saying, hey, DRC, Sudan, not the most stable countries. They've managed to contain it. So, there's still hope. And when I teach this in the spring, it will all be over, and we'll be talking in the past tense, hopefully. Thanks, guys. I've been enjoying this class. We'll see you next week, Tuesday, for a review session, and I think that's kind of the end of the class.